Hey everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Rob Phelan. I'm joined by Danny Mendonza. We are going to be your hosts for tonight's summer webinar series. I think this is webinar number 8, Danny, of the summer. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah,
My mind goes to 7.
7 or 8.
We're right there. We've enjoyed our summers, right?
I think it's 8 because we got 2 more after this, and we said we were going to do 10 total.
10.
You can find the full list of events that we have covered so far at ChooseFIFoundation.org/events. That will have all of the replays for our past events and then links for our upcoming events as well. So next week, we are talking about how to invest for kids. And this can have 2 lenses. We're probably going to address both of them. That can be, as a parent, how do you start investing on behalf of your kid? And then as a kid, how do you get started investing? Like, what do you do from their perspective as well? So we want to give parents, teachers, any grandparents, aunts, uncles, basically adults who have incentive to try and help kids invest. How do we help them get started? So please make sure you join us next week, Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern time for that one. And then the following week, I think, Danny, this one's going to be really fun. We've got basically like activities for the FI family. So like, when we think outside the box, what are some things that we can do being in the FI community that will fit within our desired budgets? So it doesn't necessarily have to be cheap or free. It just means that we are intentionally choosing this. And then also, how does it further our cause? Like, how do we help kids develop maybe some money management skills? How do we help teach them to understand financial independence? So we're going to look at some games maybe that have a FI or a money lens to them and how you can use those, as well as a variety of other activities that you can do as a family that fit into a financial independent life. We have lots of great guests for those too. Tonight, it's going to be just Danny and I. So we are flying solo tonight. We are talking about legacy planning and how to plan for the ones you love the most. So Danny, what can people expect tonight?
So we all know that in the swing of life, we get busy, we go kind of on a rapid course, and we keep moving. We get stuck sometimes in a mundane, I go to work and I come back, and there are sometimes some important conversations that need to be had that we sometimes slip up and we don't have. And I'm going to put my hand up right there and say I'm walking along with you. We are living this with you. And so this conversation is meant to be live. It's meant to be something that we go ahead and discuss. We throw conversation back and forth about a plan of action. You have loved ones. Are there some things that you've already gone ahead and done? Are there some things that you need to do, and that conversations that you need to have with your spouse, your significant other in your life in order to make sure that you've planned accordingly? So if something were to happen to you or your spouse or your significant other, that you have planned accordingly, you've made a plan, and you've put it in place for those that you love.
Yeah, so not the most comfortable conversation in the world, particularly since I am joining tonight as the person who has not done a lot of these things that we're going to talk about tonight. And I'm the person who knows we should do this. And I think my wife is listening tonight as well. And she's probably like nodding her head like, yes, we need to do this. And we haven't done it yet. We haven't put all of these steps in place that we should do to protect our futures. All right. So Danny, where should we start? I guess, what do you do in the Mendonza household? How do you account for the future?
I guess it's just starting to have a dialogue with your spouse and having some important conversations. So one that came to mind with us when we first had our first child was a will. I am by no means a guru in this area. We have still got so much to learn, and we actually were just having a conversation the other night that we've since had another child and we need to go back and revisit and update. And so that's something that we need to focus on as well. But as far as the things that come to mind right out the bat are a will, and then also dabbling in your different insurances and making sure that you have got insurance in place to have money available for your kids or your significant loved ones if something were to happen to you. And that's definitely where I would start.
Yeah. So do you have a will? That's it's not a conversation that comes up at the dinner table too often, especially not between friends, but it's an important conversation to have. And like you said, it starts with the loved ones in your lives, whether that is a spouse at home, whether it's your parents, kids who are, if you're older and you have kids who are maybe reaching adulthood, and we need to have this difficult conversation with them about, what happens if parents pass away? What happens if our parents pass away? Like, those are all things that no one really wants to think about. It's kind of like insurance. Like, nobody really wants to think about the disaster happening, but we have to plan for it because no one does plan for these things to happen. It's not like you can say, oh, yes, I am planning on having a disaster next week, so I better make sure my insurance is in order. It wouldn't be a disaster if you knew it was coming as probably as much as it could be. So a will, a trust, some other legal things we might think about tonight. Let's start with insurance, though, because I think that's probably a more comfortable area for both of us, at least. What kinds of insurance do you think the average person needs?
Generally, that comes to mind when I think just insurance is life insurance. And I will throw out the name kind of Policy Genius is something that we settled on. It allows you to go ahead and dabble and look at insurances, but also shop around. So that would definitely be somewhere that I would gravitate to, encourage people to look and dabble, just explore. So even if you would just put in the simple Google search is, life insurance. And I know that one of the first questions that comes up when you think about life insurance is, how much should I be putting towards my life insurance? What's
I
that
thought you were
number?
going to say term versus whole. And I was like, yes, that is probably the question. But no, you're right. It's probably the first question is how much?
Probably how much. And when we were having a conversation back and forth and then I was discussing this with Jonathan, I just went to the simple Policy Genius and they have a calculator there that allows you to put in some specific information, date of birth, your gender, what age you are, and it kind of throws back a ballpark number at you to start. And that was helpful for us to gauge, to have a figure in mind, and then also to be open to have a conversation because you're going to come to this conversation in very different places. Likely, you've had different experiences, you've grown up in a different space, likely, and so you need to have these conversations and be open and honest. And that's definitely something that we landed on and then continue to go back to.
Yeah, and I like that you said there's a tool to kind of help you with at least a first number. Because I think sometimes that's just where we need to start. So let's put a number down and start thinking about what would that cover if one were to pass away. When I talk to my students about this, and just for anyone who doesn't know who I am, I work as a high school math and personal finance teacher in Frederick, Maryland, as well as working with ChooseFI International Foundation. And every year I teach a math/personal finance class. And when we get to the insurance topic, it's one that most kids are kind of like, I roll insurance. Who cares? I got my car insurance. I'm done. And life insurance or health insurance, these are conversations that not many kids have talked about at home very often or know much about. And even if they did talk to their parents at home about it, I mean, hands up, how many of you were totally lost when it came to health insurance and what half of the words meant and what each of those things did and whether you were covered or not? I think most of us adults are probably still a little unsure as to okay, this is what my insurance covers. This is what I pay. This is when I pay it and all those sorts of things. So we're going to try and help break down some of those words tonight. We're going to try and think about what types of insurance you should have and how much coverage. So if we're thinking about life insurance, the purpose of life insurance at its core is if the person who's insured, so if you are in a relationship with a spouse, if one of the spouses passes away, the other one has to be able to carry on without them. And from more than just an emotional or mental standpoint, we're talking about a financial one as well. So I think you have to think about what are the debts that you and the spouse currently carry. So the moment you start taking on, say, a mortgage together, you really need to think about having life insurance because if one person passes away, the other is going to be left with that financial obligation. And for the average American household, if both spouses are working, the chances are that you needed both spouses' incomes to be able to cover all of your living expenses, such as your mortgage. There aren't too many households where you're able to live off of one spouse's income, or rather you're choosing to live off of one spouse's income and the other one is being banked or saved or invested in some way. So just make sure that that's the first place I would start, is looking at what are your financial obligations. So for the average person, it's probably a mortgage. If there's car loans, so say, each spouse has a car with a car loan, that would be the average American household, that you want to make sure you can pay off that car loan. What else would you include in that, Danny?
I also would then just go back to what are your daily expenses. So this was a conversation kind of moving from your insurance If something were to happen to me, this was a question that I had said, to my husband. If something were to happen to you, for example, what would be the daily expenses that I would need to quickly think about in order to, not just for me, but to make sure that our family stays afloat for our kids' purpose as well? So that as smooth as it can be in a very rocky, unstable environment, probably at that time. And so, just briefly, we've talked about budgeting in the past, but briefly having an awareness as to where these, number one, what these expenses are,
Mm-hmm.
and then also having a conversation about where these expenses, what they're linked to, what accounts they're linked to. And no better place, I think what really helped me when we had this conversation was listening to, was it episode 125? ChooseFI has talked to Chelsea Brennan with Smart Money Mamas. And she is a wealth of information and put my kind of beating heart at rest a little bit when I realized that, yes, we had started having conversation about a will and started to dabble in different insurances, but she had a way to put all of this information in an organized binder. And she called this the legacy binder. And that really, as soon as I found that there was something that was well organized, I calmed and I got excited about having something in place
So,
to start.
so just to kind of go back on what that was, the binder that Danny's referring to from Chelsea Brennan, this is the legacy binder that helps you organize all of the things that both spouses would need to know in the event that the other person passed away, or that if both of you passed away, that the next person who is going to be maybe looking after your kids or is going to be looking after your estate, they would be able to access everything they needed to. So we're going to have all of our bills. So all of the bills that get paid, who is paying them? What's the account? How do you access it? What are the login details? Like that's something that in our household, my wife and I pay different bills. So like she handles usually the energy bills, so the water, gas, electric. She pays those, and then I might handle some of the other bills in the house. So most of them are automated, so like that's great. But then who's got the login information for those accounts if something needs to change? And you need to make sure all of those details are laid out somewhere where both of you can find those. Amanda's my wife. We started this a couple of years ago. I think we actually sat down. We started writing down all of our passwords and login information and trying to make sure we knew where all of these accounts were. And I think we got through most of them so that if one of us passed away, we could find all of the accounts at least that we need. But we certainly haven't exhausted this list yet. But just going back to how much life insurance you need, what's the sum of all those bills? How much does it cost to keep your household moving forwards? So to keep the lights on, to keep the water going, to keep food on the table, make sure the mortgage paid. Yeah, the insurance. So like homeowners insurance that goes with that. Is there a HOA bill as well? All of these things that just allow you to keep life moving forward as you are. And that's something that a lot of people maybe don't necessarily know. I think those of us in the FI community probably do have a good idea about this because we tend to know our FI number, which is based on our annual expenses. So many of you probably have a good idea of what this number is. But if you don't, I hope this is one of the catalysts for you saying, okay, I'm going to go find out this information. Let's just lay it all out. Let's see what are all our bills, who are they going to, and how much are they for? So let's figure out how much we actually need to cover with our incomes. When my wife and I did our life insurance, we decided that we were going to make sure we could, with the policies that we got, we could pay off the mortgage. So whichever one was left alive would be able to take the life insurance and pay off the remainder of the mortgage. So they would now have an annual expense that was much reduced because the mortgage payment was gone. We also wanted to say that the person who was left behind was going to be allowed, I think we said like 3 to 5 years of grieving time. That's what we kind of said. Like you're allowed to grieve for 3 to 5 years, and then you kind of have to move on. And in that sense, we said we want our life insurance policies to cover our income for 3 to 5 years. So when we got our policies, we were like, okay, mortgage plus 5 years of my income. That's how much my life insurance policy is going to be. Mortgage plus 5 years of her income is how much her life insurance policy is going to be. And that gave the other person a lot of financial ground to stand on to kind of keep moving forward, grieve, get all our affairs in order, and then move forward. What did you do, Danny, when it came to that number?
Absolutely. That was definitely something that we considered, kind of that 3 to 5. But what we did strongly figure is that first year is probably going to be a wash, that first year. So we just looked primarily at that 1 year process. A couple of things that you also have to consider is funeral arrangements, having some of those conversations, what those costs would be right off the bat. And so that's when we look at that first year where we also factor in as well. Also knowing that you are probably going to have a period of time for that year that you might have some unpaid time. So you have to factor that in. And then you're also not going to be in the same state of mind too. So there might also be some emotional side of things that you also have to pick up in terms of grieving and being able to maybe reach out to someone. Or if you're living further away from family, being able to be with those that are loved ones and maybe factor that in. And that's a conversation that we had, knowing that my parents, still are in Southern Africa. For us, it was important to also factor in travel. I might need to take the kids and be surrounded by who I love and know first and foremost.
At a very short notice. I mean, someone passes away. Like if it's not something you knew that was coming, then you need to okay, kids, we're packing bags, we're getting on a plane. So-and-so has passed away and we need to be there within a couple of days. I remember that happened to me when I first started my job after college. So I was 24, just started my first big kid job as a teacher. And 2 weeks into the job, my grandmother passed away. So my grandmother was in Ireland at the time, which is where most of my family is. And it wasn't a purely financial decision. There was a lot of factors in here, but I was not able to go home for that funeral. So I didn't feel comfortable because I just started a job. I was like, I can't do that. It would have been a very large expense, particularly booking a flight to Ireland with very short notice. So you may have been looking at $1,000+ for return flights. Accommodation wouldn't have been an issue, thankfully, because family, but it wasn't an expense that we probably could have taken on very easy. That would have been a tough one to take on. And just like you, that's something that we have to consider, that what happens if you do need to fly home very short notice? Is that in your emergency fund? Which also, we didn't even talk about emergency funds.
Absolutely. So that was going to be my next kind of, we had discussed that as far as our emergency fund was concerned. Have we factored in travel? For us, it's just got to be something that we've got to do. We knew that getting married, I was very open and honest that travel was going to be, I was coming to the United States, but that meant that I was going to need to be able to travel. That was something I valued. So again, taking us back to Rob's earlier comment, is sometimes a lot of these conversations remind you to go back and think, what do I value? What do we value as a family? And as a result, I'm putting those checks and balances in my action plan. And Chelsea Brennan does a wonderful job of taking this legacy binder. It's roughly, and I'm going to say it out loud, and some of you might, it's roughly 90 pages. It's broken into, it's thick, okay? But that 90 pages does include being broken into 16 sections. It does it does include the kind of riffraff, as you would say, the binders, the sections that separate, and double entities on either side. So not to be overwhelmed. One of the things that I did with the binder is I took it in chunks, and I started with our general household information. And I realized that while I knew a lot of these things, I'm generally the person that takes 90% care of our kiddos in the day. And so as far as doctor's appointments and all of the numbers associated with that, I've done a lot of those appointments. And so I realized, not to any fault of Jonathan's, is that I hadn't articulated and put these numbers in a place where he would be able to know if something happened to me. I think roughly a couple of months before the pandemic, I had gotten really sick to the point where I had, I just, when mom gets sick, you're out. And he had to step up a little bit. And it was kind of a shock to the system of, where are all these numbers? Someone has to take care of, what are we juggling? And it was just a good reminder on either side. Like you said, Rob, you lean on what you feel comfortable with sometimes. And so you forget that your spouse, your significant other might be picking up some things in your household and running them. And then you don't know anything about them.
And I think in a well-organized team, there's no point in both of you focusing on the same task.
Absolutely.
Like we divide and conquer. So, each person takes on a different role in the house. And, you obviously, in a harmonious marriage, the tasks are divided evenly and each person feels like the other is pulling a significant amount of weight in the household running and responsibilities and that sort of thing. But yeah, make sure you know what the other person's actually doing and how it's done, so that if they are out of action, and like you said, being sick, or your spouse having to go on vacation or go away for a conference or something like that, like where they're just like out of the picture for a couple of weeks, I'm sure is a big eye opener for the other person. Oh, there's a lot of things I don't know about, like either it's kids or finances or different tasks that have to happen or organizations that we're a part of, like you name it. Like there's probably so many different plate spinning in the average household.
Absolutely. And something that you had mentioned earlier that I really wanted to make sure we didn't miss is you had said that you had spent time with Amanda going through all of your passwords and making sure that you were aligned and you knew where everything was. And so we use a system called LastPass, LASTPASS, and we rarely lean on. I think Chelsea Brennan mentions this in the episode 125. But she also does mention something else. She also makes sure that you have added that significant other to your LastPass password system. So if something were to happen to you, they are able to get in to get all of your passwords. Yes. So just a reminder there, something that I kind of ding, 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 and I had double checked with Jonathan as well to make sure we had done. Just constant ongoing communication. And also a reminder, what I have tried to lean on doing, I'm by no means a guru in this area, but I had attempted to have regular check-ins. So we might have a date night and we might say, okay, this is just a relaxed date night versus this is a date night where we've got to check in about some financial information. We've got to just make sure we're on the same page. Yep. Some cards have changed. We might have been taking advantage of some travel rewards. We've switched up some of the cards, and we need to just make sure we're all on a level playing field.
Yeah, and for some families that happens once a month when you sit down and do your budget for the upcoming month. So you could just tag in, does anything need to be updated in terms of our financial information or our personal information, if any passwords changed? LastPass is a password management system. It's good. I would say it's good internet responsibility. So you're being a good digital citizen by using a password manager. I feel like we're not an affiliate for LastPass in any way. It's just we both happen to use it. And it allows you to create complex passwords that are not easily guessed, which means that you're probably not remembering most of them. So you just have to remember your master key to get into your LastPass, and then it remembers all of your passwords for you. You need to make sure that your spouse has the master key as well, and that's safely secure somewhere in your house. Okay, so just kind of going back to where we were with the number and what the legacy binder is. The legacy binder is not a legal document. It is not your will and testament. It is not anything that someone can bring to court and say, like, this is what Danny and Jonathan wanted. I'm sure they could try. And if there is no other document in place, like no other will and testament, maybe it would have some standing, but we don't necessarily want to just rely on a legacy binder for this, right?
No, absolutely not. And that does take us regarding that life insurance, but then also back to the will, is a reminder that I know when you think of these tasks that you've got to check off and fulfill and go through, that there are expenses associated with them. And I did, in listening to Chelsea Brennan's episode with ChooseFI, I did at that time scratch down, I think she mentioned tomorrow.me, where there was the ability to actually download an app that allowed you to look at a will and a trust and set something that was basic up for free. Mm. So roughly, if you're looking at hiring a lawyer to come and set the will and put the will in place, you're probably looking at $1,500 to $2,000 if you were to hire a lawyer to come in. And so this might be a way for your family to get something in terms of documentation down on paper, get something started, and you've always got wiggle room to improve and expand upon in the future. But what we're just encouraging you to do is start somewhere, have the conversations and get something that's legally binding in place. So with that will, you've basically got that person that's acting as that power of attorney who's helping you make, some of those decisions, but then also reminding you to think about those conversations. If something happened to me, have I got the money in place? But have I also thought about the first one that came to my mind, who would get our kids if something happened to either one of us? And do we agree on that? Mm-hmm. That was a good, open, honest conversation that we had to have. Do we agree where we would send our kiddos?
Yeah, if Say like my son, for example, does not have godparents. Like we didn't have like a formal baptism where you've had a conversation already where you're like, okay, these are the two people that we are kind of electing right now to sort of be like the stand-in parents should we not be available. Like I feel like in a lot of families, the godparents end up being the people that would eventually end up caring for your kids anyway. But if that's all you've got, you probably want to just kind of revisit that idea again, especially with your spouse, and just make sure you're on the same page that are we both cool with these people raising our kid if we are not available to do that. And if it's, what would you do if you're at odds about it?
Well,
I'm totally throwing you under the bus here.
No, that's okay. I would be open and honest with you guys, and that we had to have a good conversation about it, because we actually weren't in the same place about ours.
Didn't know that.
No, we weren't. I'm from Southern Africa, and so I immediately I was like, of course they would go home, and he's like, well, where's home? So that was just a good conversation to have, right? We openly had to say, oh, well, what's this? And not to kind of go into ridiculous personal information here, but we had to go ahead and look at not just who, but we also went into, is there someone that we financially trust that would make good decisions for our family if it wasn't us? Who do we value in our lives that also thinks in a similar way to us that would make, because there's also someone who you might absolutely love, respect, enjoy, but if you really be honest, you would say, probably not, right? And so it's a good conversation to have. If you don't agree, I would kind of remind you to come to, is there a way that you can come to a middle ground, right? If you were to do your checks and balances, I think what we did is wrote down kind of like, not to sound morbid, but pros and cons on either side and why we would disagree. Not in a we're having a spat way, but why we would disagree. And a reminder, safety was one of our concerns. So why, and that was an important one that allowed us to come to a happy medium, was safety.
So yeah, you've got the, who is going to raise your kids in the way that you would like. You've got the environment, and then you've also got the whole financial side, because part of your will is going to be, who gets your kids, but also how are they going to financially care for your kids? So there is a transfer of money or a trust that needs to be put in place that will dictate, how much money is going to be made available to this caregiver to raise your child. And you, of course, need to trust that person that they will use the money for what they're supposed to use it for, not abuse that power in any way. And those are all conversations that need to be had. And the other one that we didn't mention is check in with the person as well and make sure that they're cool with it.
Absolutely. And then also that kind of like that power, that power of attorney. So who is able to make those decisions for you, those more trustworthy decisions if need be. And a bigger thing that you might laugh, Rob, but I actually found myself going into this rabbit hole. So I sat down with the binder. So I've talked about it's a 90-page binder. It's in 15 to 16 sections. And I'm literally taking each section at a time, and I'm kind of grabbling and having conversations, and would say to Jonathan on one random evening, okay, so I'm asking you these questions. And he says, really? Do I have to, we have, he said, do I have to honest that now? Like, well, when is there?
When did you think this was going to happen? Yeah.
So I'm having the conversation, we're discussing it. And then I realized I woke up middle of the night and I realized, where have I put this legacy binder? If something were to happen to me, even tomorrow, have I put it in a place that someone would find it? Or if I put it in a Danny place that allows me to know where it is? And believe you me that, Rob, there are Danny places in our house
where I kind of have
thought through. Yes. So I've thought through it, and Jonathan's like, I wouldn't think to put it there. Why would you put it there? So it's just an open, honest conversation. I think Chelsea Brennan reminds us, not just with LastPass to get on the same page there, but she also reminds us there is not just a written copy. So you can either do one of two things. You can print this off. So I think it's a $39 fee. So it's not a substantial amount of money. When you're talking about having these conversations, having an organized process to lay this all out in and start somewhere, $39. And then she talks about, she gives you kind of a couple of hints. What would you do if?
Couple of prompts. Yeah. Like just let's guide that conversation. Cause I tried to DIY this, and it's such a maze of like all the things you keep forgetting, like, oh, I forgot this. And just to have, someone laying out like, this is what you should think of. Kind of why I like YNAB as well, is that it has the budget categories already built in. So you're not like leaving something out.
Absolutely. I love the fact that it's not a blank. It's not a blank slate. It's not a blank
Yeah.
canvas. And you can obviously dabble and change things up. First thing comes to mind is I have done like a little baby book for my kids so that they can have conversations if I was not there. Right? They can see what their childhood looked like, etc. Well, there is a section in the binder that talks about leaving a note for your loved ones and being able to talk about stories. And I will be very honest with you, life gets busy. I wouldn't have done that. I've done the baby binder, but I wouldn't have left my kiddos a little note that talked to them about things I loved, talked to them, written Jonathan a note about things that I appreciated. And how often in the mundane day-to-day life do we forget sometimes to say those? So number one, it was a really good reminder to get me to go back to the baseline. What do I value? And kind of come back and have a conversation at the dinner table, even with our kids around. What do we value? What's important to our family? And then, as far as the binder was concerned, two places, not to lose track of thought. One was the digital copy, as well as you could print it out. So I realized I made the mistake at the start, is we printed ours off and I started writing it down. And I realized that if I were to do it again, I would probably do the digital version and type it all up. So I'm getting everything in place, having it in one place to start, and then going back, and I'm probably going to enter it all in a digital copy. And then that will allow me to make changes over time. So as things change, for example, in that binder, it talks to you about important contact information. It talks to you about maybe your kids are going to a certain school, who would be your emergency contacts, not just who would you call, but also the names and numbers of the places. Down from, this is all in your general household information. So that first section, and it's big and it's onerous, but it allowed me to get all of those numbers, the contacts, everything that was in my phone. Even with a phone today, if something happened to my phone, I would be at a loss with all those numbers. So it's a good way to have all of those numbers in one place and allow someone else maybe that's not walking through your shoes currently to see it. So just a reminder, you would take that copy, you would put it in a place, and maybe put it somewhere that's fireproof as well. Maybe you have a safe, maybe you make a copy, and then you also take a copy and you put it in another loved one's home as well. So if something were to happen to both of you, something were to happen where one of you couldn't be having a dialogue, someone else knows that you have this binder.
And I'm assuming, like, if it's a digital copy, it's not sitting on your laptop, which is password protected, the average person can't get into. You're probably saving it onto like a USB key and putting that in your fireproof safe. Or my wife and I have a fireproof pouch. So like we didn't have enough stuff to put in a safe, so we just bought a pouch. So if our house did burn down, there would just be this black pouch. Of course, it's black. It's gonna be so hard to find. But it's in there, and hopefully it works. And the reviews were great. And it has at least our most important documents in there. And that's where I would put that thumb drive with this binder. And then, thumb drives, they're so cheap these days. Like, make a couple of copies, put them out in different places with loved ones. And then I would probably just bring it back like once a year and update it, right?
Yes. And that's the positive of it being the digital copy, not just the written. So for me, I like to kind of get all my thoughts and train of thoughts. But if I were to do it again, I would have definitely just probably started in the digital, because I'm finding all that information anyway. It would have saved me time. But right now, I'm just working off of a printed off copy, and then I'm going to put it into the digital copy. And then my idea is get it on the thumb drive, and then also have that thumb drive make a copy and actually hand it to someone else, right? Have that conversation, also check in with who's associated with who's on my will, and have that person also have that copy as well.
And you could also print it once a year. Like if you had access to a printer, like an office printer, and you wanted to print it off once per year with the updated version, just to have a physical copy somewhere. So say like you have parents who are not the most tech savvy in the world. I'm just using parents as an example. There's plenty of not tech savvy young people as well, but you just could have like a physical copy somewhere to be like, okay, this has been updated on January 1st, 2021. We'll update again on January 1st, 2022. And until then, this is what you can work off of.
Absolutely. I suppose kind of your question at the beginning was, what things would you do for your family? So a couple of things, every family is different, that would come to mind. We think we've touched on the will, kind of what's our estate look like? What is our money? How is our money housed, and what would it look like? And then we've touched on life insurance. We've got home insurance as well. And then for some families, depending on where you're working as well, also might be disability insurance. So it might not be that you're actually you do die, but
Same idea
something
as life
happens to you.
insurance. Yeah, you're protecting your
Exactly.
income.
Exactly. And then you're thinking about kind of what your job intends, what you need to do. So if you need to use your hands and something happened to your hands, and then, well, that's kind of, and another conversation that we also had is, if something were to happen to you, what would be a fallback? What would be another avenue that you might explore? Another conversation that we've just had.
Yeah.
And hadn't had.
And just like, there's so many things like that you probably don't want to talk about, like advanced directives. Like, what happens if, like say your spouse needs to be put on life support? Do they want to be on life support? Do they not? If they die, what do they want? I think I looked it up there just while you were talking. Like, the average funeral cost in the US is $7,640 as of July 12th, according to Bankrate. So 7,000 to do like a traditional burial, a casket, that sort of thing. Like, is that what your spouse wants, or do they want something different? Do they want something, like cremation, or do they want like the most extravagant fancy party that you've ever seen? And they expect you to make that happen. So just make sure all of these things are clear. Each person knows, and have the plan for what happens if both of you are incapacitated. So it's one thing to say my spouse knows, but what happens if you guys are together? So both in the same car accident, both go down on the same plane, both whatever, fall off a mountain together. Like, what happens to the people that are left behind, and who gets to make those decisions?
Absolutely. And I'm not sure about you, but having this conversation is definitely difficult. It's not something that comes naturally. It's not easy. It's not your regular day-to-day conversation. So you are going to have to stretch yourself. You're going to have to encourage each other. And that's where I encourage you to reach out to whoever that person is in your life that you're with, and have a conversation. Start today. Start small. What I liked about this binder is that I didn't just look at the entirety of those 90 pages. I broke it up into sections. I've been doing it for a while. I keep coming back to it, and life gets busy and I stop and I keep going. And then also, in a perfect world, you break those parts of the binder up, and then you come back together and have a conversation about them. So it allows you to have a more thorough conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I like that it is chunked up. Like, you don't have to do all 90 pages in one go. And some of you might be like, 90 pages, oh my gosh, that's like a college thesis. And some might be like, oh, 90 pages, wonderful. Someone's thought of everything, and I don't have to think that much about this. I'm probably leaning towards the latter, actually. Even though 90 sounds like an intimidating amount, I'm kind of like, thank goodness somebody has thought of everything. There's 90 pages of stuff that we need to think about. So whatever way you think about it, like, I would encourage you to consider looking at this binder or creating your own. Like, you can, of course, in the ChooseFI and the financial independence community, you can DIY this and just sit down with your spouse and try and think of what is everything that the other person or whoever survives us needs to know if we were no longer there to make decisions or carry out tasks or whatever it is, and start storing that information and make it digital if possible, and something that you guys schedule and update each year. Now, and let's say, go on.
My apologies. Something that also came to mind and that got me thinking is, so I was packing for our family. We went on a short family, just visiting family that's close by. And I realized that if something were, I go through all of these checks and balances when we leave, and packing the diapers and the clothes and this bag, and I use this. But I realized that my kids have become accustomed to the way things are done in our family. So we run things in a particular way. Now, if something were to unsettle that and something were to happen, the bigger thing for me was, would I provide enough information to provide an opportunity for someone else to run my ship as smoothly as I could? Because kids are adaptable and they are far more resilient than we are. But whoever's in your life would appreciate there being something that's smoothed when there's so much that's rocky. And so that's how I kind of thought about that in general, is even going ahead and handing my kids off to their grandparents while we go on a date night. I like things done a certain way. My kids respond to things and do better when they know what to expect. And so that was helpful for me to just think about tiny little pieces of information like that. Manageable, small tasks.
And that's not something that's unique to a household. Like, that's something that comes up in businesses and employment all the time, where you have to provide basic instructions for how somebody could do your job if you weren't able to do it. So say you leave the company, or you get promoted or you have to go on vacation. Like I'm struck. The word for it is evading me, but it's almost like an operation manual. Like what is the step-by-steps of how to do your job? And it's the same thing with your household. How do you run your household? It doesn't have to be like a total like script for like everything you need. But yeah, I think the babysitter is a huge one where like you leave and you have a babysitter coming over and you want to keep as much of the routine there as possible so your kids assimilate to that new person as easily as possible. And having it written down, or at least thinking through the steps, is sometimes the hardest part. I know as like a small business owner that when I eventually and hopefully start to expand, I'm going to have to train somebody to do what I do. And half the time we don't even think about what we do. It's all on autopilot. So have you even thought of like, what are all the things I do in my house? Have you ever tried to list it out? It would be a
I
long
would be
list,
honest,
I'm
I've
sure.
lain in bed one night and I have done that. I have thought through, but I've fallen asleep. It's
That's
it's
a
kind of
great
like
way to
counting
fall
sheep.
asleep. Here's all the things I need to do.
Yeah, no, it took a little bit longer, but definitely that's. And I think my husband's, he had responded to, I was going through the list, and he said they'll be okay. Just they're gonna survive. And I
You know where
said,
the food
well,
is?
well, you see, my personality, I would say, I want that person to also have a smooth experience as well. I don't want them to be thrown to the wolves. I want them to enjoy my kids for who they are too. So that's kind of the reminder there. But just
I
personal
think there's a
touch.
lot to that. I know my son thrives in routine, and if like his parents are gone, my goodness, let's try and keep something familiar to him as much as possible. So yeah, having that sort of stuff you wouldn't necessarily think of including, but the legacy binder, I guess, accounts for that. Like, what are the routines and procedures that you need to remember or pass on to whoever's going to be left behind? And I think, yeah, spouses especially. Like, if one person does more of the scheduling, one person does more of the driving or the cooking or the cleaning or whatever it is, what's the procedure manual for that? All right, so let's assume that they're motivated. Hopefully my wife and I are motivated now, and we're going to actually go get a will. We were mentioned tomorrow.me as a site that you could start with. I've heard of things like LegalZoom as well. None of this, by the way, just to put out there, is legal or financial information. This is all entertainment purposes only. So please make sure you are consulting CPAs and lawyers for any of these decisions. But I think, if we were going to go and try and find a lawyer to do this, how did you guys do it? Because you said you got a lawyer. How did you like just Google it, lawyers near me, or how did you go about finding a lawyer?
We definitely went ahead and looked at our community and leaned on a community. We knew when we were having conversations ourselves, we found that those conversations between us then became conversations that we had with those that we saw, pockets that were friends, etc. And so as you have more conversations with other people about them, you have not in entirety, most actually that we had didn't have a will, but there are one or two people. And so we actually leaned on the ChooseFI community. Something would come to mind for us you've got those wonderful local groups. You've got a bunch of people who think like you in a location. Why not lean on them? Put out in that local group and say to them, I am in, we're in this area. Does anyone have a lawyer that you've used? And you're going to look and shop around just like you would. Like we've talked about insurances. I liked Policy Genius because it allowed me to look at different insurances and it did that shopping for me. But that would be the same thing with the lawyer. And then we found someone that we had trusted that also had worked on other people in our lives, their wills as well. And we went to reputable law firms as well. So that's how we kind of dabbled and went from there. But the honest and open conversation was even reach out in your local group. Find people in your community who are like-minded and having those similar conversations, and you'll realize that you're not alone. I think that's also the reminder as well. When you're doing a lot of this and you're feeling the pressure to check off a list, you forget that others around you are living and are making similar choices. And why not lean on them? Just like a mother's group that I would lean on, and I would ask them questions as I'm going through motherhood, I would do the same thing.
And for anyone who is not familiar with what we're talking about, the ChooseFI local groups are active members of the financial independence community who probably either listen to the ChooseFI podcast or who follow the blog or the YouTube channel, or they might just belong to the Facebook group. We have a hugely active main Facebook group. So if you go onto Facebook.com and then just search ChooseFI. So you can see on the top right of the screen. You will find a Facebook group with, I think, over 60 to 70,000 members. And this is a wonderful place to go and just ask financial questions. You will have so many people in there who are extremely patient, extremely willing to share their experience, their knowledge, what they did themselves. But if you want something more localized like this, like I want a lawyer in my area, I want a plumber in my area, I want to buy a car in my area, like those are all questions I've asked. You can go find a local group to use. So this is just members of the ChooseFI or financial independence community who are in your geographic location. And there are more groups in the US than there are any other country, but there are groups in countries outside of the United States as well. And if you follow the link at the bottom of the screen, choosefi.com/local, you can find out where the closest group to you is. I know where I am in Maryland, there's one in Frederick, Maryland, there's one in Baltimore, Maryland, and then there's one down in Washington, D.C. And those would be the 3 groups closest to me. And I probably would ask all 3 of them just to see, like, is there a very reputable lawyer who specializes in estate law planning? So like, we're not just looking for a general lawyer. We're looking for someone who specifically does wills and trusts. Maybe somebody who has met somebody in the financial independence community before, because there's maybe some nuances to what we want to do. So we think about things differently sometimes, and it's nice to have somebody who's a little bit more familiar with that. I find the same thing with accountants. Like, if I'm looking for an accountant, I want an accountant who is actually, if I say the word financial independence or FI, they know what I'm talking about. Because if they don't, I'm probably going to have questions from them they may not be able to answer, may not be familiar with.
I also love that you mentioned plumbers, because just the other day, even sitting down to revisit the binder, I was actually in the general information category, writing down all sorts of people that we use to do with our home that I might have taken for granted, that we called them once or twice, we don't use them in a while, and so we don't have that number as readily available. And one of the things that we did in our local Richmond group is we have a document where we put information about handymen that we use and that are trusted, and also with a FI lens that we appreciate. So not only do we trust, but also are a good price for what they do. And so that was another reminder, and I was jotting down some of those numbers and making sure that I go back to that. Again, smooth. If there were a transition in our family, those are some of the things. You're not going to, you've lost your loved one, you might not prevent the washing machine breaking down. And so you've got to have those conversations and readily available numbers for anyone that would need them.
I like that, a little ChooseFI, like Angie's list for each area, like who are reputable vendors that we recommend. And one thing I do as well is I go into the group and I just use the search feature and see if anyone's asked this question before. And that can sometimes be just a very quick way to get the information you want. But you will find in probably 99.9% of these groups that if you ask a question, you will have people jump on it to answer it for you. So it's a place that is a very safe spot to ask a question. You're not going to get judged or ridiculed. And there's probably already a lot of information going on in there. And hopefully we're starting to see some local meetups again. I think Richmond had a local meetup recently, like in-person local meetup, which is awesome. I'm sure they're starting to happen around the country as it becomes safe to do so. But yeah, have a look and see if any of those are going on near you, and maybe meet some people who live in your area that are thinking in a way like that you do or you want to. And especially people who've done it before you. Like, I love talking to the people in my area who are that bit further ahead on the journey than I am. And I can ask them lots of questions about, like, what did you do? How did you do it? What people in the area helped you get to that spot? And that's a great way to get great recommendations or references or ideas for what to do.
Absolutely, because just a reminder to everyone who has tuned in and is following us, we are by no means expert in this dialogue and this conversation. Even Rob admitted at the very beginning, and me myself, I'm working through this binder. We're continuing to improve, and we're just why we're here. And even with ChooseFI Foundation, we are encouraging you to have conversations that are important, meaningful, and valuable to you and your families. We want others to share in the joy of those experiences as well, because they had them. So they're thinking ahead, planning ahead, and as a result, having these good conversations and not receiving all this information that's thrown at us, having done no planning, but actually acting because you've done the planning.
And if you do have questions about the binder, we will have Chelsea Brennan joining us, not next week, but the week after, which I think is August 10th. It's not about legacy planning, but I'm sure we could squeeze a couple of questions in there for her if we want to, if you have any questions about the legacy binder and you want to know more. but you can also check it out, using the links that we gave. I think it was, ChooseFI.com/binder. So just, I guess, a recap, Danny, because we are almost at the top of the hour and we want to make sure we've, I guess, closed all the loops. When we're thinking about the future, we are trying to protect our assets. We're trying to protect our children if we have children, or our spouse if we have a spouse. And we're trying to make sure that if some piece of the puzzle is missing, the others are able to carry on without that piece. They can pick up and move forward. And we don't want anyone to be a bottleneck or the keeper of all the keys. And then when they're gone, everything's lost. So that goes for, all of your financial assets. So, there really shouldn't be any secret bank accounts out there anyway. But, if you've got different accounts in different places, make sure your spouse knows where all those things are. If you have adult children, make sure they know where all those things are. They don't need to know how much is in there, but just make sure they know, like, if we passed away, you've got to look for checking account, savings account, an online account. We've got brokerage, we've got retirement. Those should all be coming to you. And one thing we didn't talk about is making sure that the beneficiaries on those accounts are all up to date as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I guess if I were to put it kind of into a couple of steps that we would take right off the bat, I would encourage you guys to get this binder. It's easy, it's simple, it's laid out for you, and then you can adapt and move. But in general, what we've done for our family is 6 months to a year in expenses that we're thinking through, trying to at minimum, okay? Because when you have lost that loved one, costs that are going to come to mind, funeral and end of life expenses, you're going to have that grieving period, which is probably going to be without pay, potentially. And then you're going to have to make sure that you continue. If you haven't paid off your home, you might have a mortgage that's ongoing. The bill's going to continue to come in. And then you've got those day-to-day expenses. That's kind of in a nutshell that we would go. And then I would start by looking at your will, your insurance, so life insurance to start and health insurance. And then from there, delving in to your general home information. Getting all of that information up to speed in one place and having a conversation with that person, whoever that is, so that others know about this important information.
Yeah. And just going back to the beneficiaries, I got this question once and I had to go look up the answer. So if you have, say, a brokerage account, or let's say a retirement account, and you name the beneficiary as your spouse, divorce happens, it does happen, and the person remarries. And in their will, they say, I want all of my financial assets to go to my new spouse. If you have not updated the beneficiary on your retirement account, I think the beneficiary trumps any will when it comes to who gets what money. So that's, I believe that I'd have to double check that. Maybe someone in the audience can verify that for us. But I believe the beneficiary on the account will trump any request in a will when it comes to who gets the money. So like if you have, your old retirement account has not been updated, then, and your old spouse is still named as the beneficiary on that, even if they're not in your will, I think the money would go to them and the will would not be able to prevent that from happening, or to basically trump it and get the money back to where you want it to go originally. So make sure you go through all your accounts, update the beneficiaries. And that's your accounts, that's your life insurance, pensions, anything that if you pass away, there is some value to pass on to someone else, and any of your assets as well. So your house, like who is that going to if you pass away? Any automobiles, that sort of stuff. Now that's usually contained in your general will, but some of the bigger ones may not be. So like, for example, I have 2 books out in the world. If I were to pass away, I need to make sure that any royalties that are earned from those would in fact pass on to my wife and son, and not just kind of disappear into the world because Amazon or Ingram or whoever didn't know who to pay. So yeah, make sure you're thinking of all of those different things as well. Any final words of wisdom, Danny, before we wrap up tonight? Besides, get the binder and do it, or at least start thinking about this stuff.
I guess the ending would be, don't be overwhelmed by all of the information. Start somewhere. If something were to happen to you, even tomorrow, have you done something that would make those lives that you leave behind smoother? It would make the transition smoother, and as a result, it would be easier. Even down to decluttering a house or a home. there would be a great start, something small and meaningful that you can start on. And I would
1%
say,
each day, right?
1% each day. And
Mhm.
then I would say, and I'm even reminded in saying this out loud, what do you value? And are you doing what you value?
Yes. Do your actions reflect that value? That's always one of those like smack in the face gut moments where you're like, no, I'll go change it.
It's a good reminder. But sometimes even then we get stuck, right? We get stuck in the mundane, continuing going in this wheel.
Yeah.
What
All
do we
right.
value?
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. So this, was a duo episode with Danny and I. We did not have a guest speaker tonight, but next week we are going to be coming back at 8 p.m. on Tuesday. We are talking about investing for kids. And like I said, this is going to be investing from the lens of a parent. Like, how do I start investing for my kids? So try and get their nest egg growing early. And then on the other side, if I was a kid, how would I get started investing? So how can you help the kids around you to get started on their own investing journey if they are showing an interest in it? Or we'll probably even talk about how do you start an interest in that sort of thing as well. So make sure you put that on your calendar. You can go to ChooseFIFoundation.org/events, and that has links. So there's a YouTube link. Pretty much as soon as we hang up this call, I'll be able to turn on the Facebook link for next week. So the site we're using, StreamYard, does not allow you to schedule out more than a week on Facebook, but it does let you schedule out on YouTube. So you can go, if you're watching YouTube or if you're on Facebook, you can watch on YouTube and you can click set reminder. If you are on YouTube, please do us a favor and hit subscribe, and also click the little bell that will remind you anytime we go live in the future. If you're on Facebook, give us a like, give us a follow. We'd love to know what you thought, as well as leave some comments. If you have any questions that we didn't answer tonight, which there's probably a lot because we didn't try and give out any sort of detailed advice whatsoever, let us know what your questions are, and we will try and find that information for you and maybe include it in the comments, or come back another time, or just pass on to Brad and Jonathan and say, you guys tackle this because you're the experts.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much for joining us tonight. We'll see you next week.